Joining us now is Brad Bowman. He is Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He's also a former Army Black Hawk helicopter pilot himself. Brad, good to see you. Today, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said this war is not endless. President Trump has said it will be short-term, calling it a little excursion at one point. What is, from your perspective, a realistic timeline for people to expect this to last?
You know, I think the timeline depends on the objectives. I agree with the premise of your question that there have been mixed messages, both in terms of timeline and objectives. But obviously, those two things are related, right? If you have more extensive objectives, you're going to need more time to accomplish them. There has been some assemblage around three core military objectives. That's destruction of Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile program, including the missiles, launchers, and production capacity, as well as the destruction of its Navy. I think seriously degrading, if not destroying all of that, is roughly a 3 to 4 week military campaign. Of course, we're 10 to 12 days into it. But if you expand that to regime change, obviously that's a whole nother thing, and that will change the timeline involved.
Yeah, and we were talking with our correspondents about the mixed messages. I mean, it's just a fact that there's different things being said by different people. From a military perspective, does conflicting information affect the troops, the people actually carrying out the mission?
I think most of the people carrying out the mission have clear marching orders. If you look at the commander of U.S. Central Command, Admiral Brad Cooper, he's been crystal clear that they understand the mission, and they're very focused on, again, the destruction of Iran's nuclear program, the destruction of their Navy, and the destruction of Iran's ballistic missile program. And they're making great progress. They've said they've hit more than 5,000 targets. More than 50 Iranian naval vessels have been damaged or destroyed. And between the day 1 and day 7, they've talked about a 90% reduction in Iranian ballistic missile launches and about an 83% reduction in drone launches. So there's going to be tough days ahead for sure, but we're flowing in more combat power today than we have at any point, and I think we're going to make progress there. But again, if you expand the objectives to include regime change, that's a whole nother thing.
And Brad, President Trump has not ruled out sending ground troops, something on the ground in Iran. In an interview a few days ago, he said, actually, I'm sorry, I wanted to ask you about your interview a few days ago where you said that that would be an absolute disaster. Why do you think that?
I stand by that. It would be my view. You know, I taught at West Point and graduated from West Point. I've had friends not return from Iraq and Afghanistan. I think deploying American ground troops to Iran would be a huge mistake, a big mistake. It would shift the conflict from America's comparative advantages, airstrikes and things like that, to a ground combat where our relative military advantages would be less, and there would be much higher risk for casualties. Now, some will say, well, what about a small special forces raid? But history tells us that things that start small can grow. And if I were still spending I worked in the U.S. Senate for 9 years, advising members of the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee, I would want to hear what is the requirement for ground troops? Why can't that be accomplished from the air? And if there is something where ground troops would be helpful, how do you compare the advantages of that ground insertion with the risks associated with it? These are the kind of questions that I hope and expect that staff and members of the Armed Services and Foreign Relations and Intel committees are asking right now.
General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was asked about the military escorting ships through the Strait of Hormuz. He said they would look at a range of options if they were asked to do so. What are the potential options you see and the pros and cons of them?
Well, we know that the Strait of Hormuz is one of the top maritime and energy choke points in the world. Iran has long threatened and tried to close that strait before. They have a variety of means to do it: anti-ship missiles, aerial drones, unmanned surface vessels, fast attack boats, and mines. Mines can be employed in a variety of ways. I would also talk about things like submarine and aircraft and other things, but most of those have been destroyed. The U.S. military can do this, but it's not risk-free. And if we take the time to eliminate Iran's offensive means, it'll be safer and there'll be fewer casualties.
Brad Bowman, really great to have you with us. Thank you. Appreciate it.